Welcome, and thank you for standing by. All participants will be able to listen only. Today's conference is being recorded. If you have any objections, you may disconnect at this time. I would now like to turn the conference over to Ms. Elise DeGeorge. Ms., you may begin.
Hi, good morning, everyone, and good afternoon to some of those calling from abroad. Welcome. This is the second webinar of an ongoing quarterly webinar series developed as part of IEA Wind Task 34, also known as WREN, working together to resolve the environmental effects of wind energy. This series has been developed to further WREN's goal to create a shared global knowledge base and community of practice around research, monitoring, and management of the environmental effects of wind energy development. For each of these webinars, we'll aim to provide a global perspective on some of our most pressing issues and topics of interest around the environmental effects of wind energy. So we're excited about this quarterly webinar series. This particular webinar is on the topic of marine mammal and avian behavior at offshore wind farms. The way we're going to, the agenda for this call is that we'll have two speakers. We're excited to have Dr. Ross Mcgregor, and I'll introduce them shortly, each of the speakers, and also Dr. Debbie Russell. For more information on IEA Wind Task 34, you can go to the website, and I will put this on at the end of the webinar as well, this slide that shows contact information, if you could flip to that, yes, where we have a link to the IEA Wind site. This will be the location where you'll be able to see the presentations as well as the audio from each of these webinars, and that's www.ieawind.org, and or you could contact the operating agent, Karen Sinclair, or myself, Elise, or Sam Rooney. And we'll have this contact information put back up at the end of the call. So each of our speakers will present for about 20 to 25 minutes on their topics, and the lines will be muted during the two presentations. At the end of these two presentations, we are going to open up the lines and help foster some interactive dialogue where you'll be able to ask Dr. Mcgregor and Dr. Russell questions on their topics, or you could talk to one another about some of the topics that have come up during the presentations. So we look forward to some interesting dialogue following the presentation. And at the very end of the webinar, we'd like to just take a few minutes to solicit some input on future topics of interest that we can cover on these webinars going forward. So thank you again for your participation in this webinar series. I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Ross Mcgregor, and I'll tell you a little bit about him before I turn the call over to him. And then before Dr. Russell speaks, we'll present her brief bio as well. So Dr. Mcgregor has worked for Natural Power as a senior ornithologist since October 2012, where he provides ornithological expertise on the offshore renewables industry. Ross joined Natural Power from Scottish Natural Heritage, where he was their marine renewables ornithologist, providing advice to government, industry, and consultants on potential impacts to bird populations from all of Scotland's offshore developments. From 2007 to 2009, he was a postdoctoral scientist at Virginia Tech in the USA, where he studied the demographics of endangered red-cockaded woodpecker populations on U.S. Department of Defense bases. 2 years prior to this, Ross was a postdoctoral researcher at Florida State University, where he studied the morphology of North Atlantic right whales in relation to the energetics of locomotion. Ross has a PhD in zoology from the University of St. Andrews. Over to you, Dr. Mcgregor.
Thank you very much. Good morning to those of you in the States, and afternoon to anyone on this side of the Atlantic. It's a kind of dark and stormy afternoon here. So what I'm going to talk to everyone about this afternoon is work that Natural Power consultants have been doing on an offshore wind farm in the southwest of Scotland called Robin Rig. That's the name of the wind farm. Let me just move on to the next slide. So today I'll talk to you about, I'll give you a brief introduction to the wind farm itself, the key species key bird species we've been looking at this operational wind farm, and the survey methods and analytical methods we've used to look at the effect of the wind farm on the bird life in the area. How we went about getting abundance estimates of the birds within the wind farm and in the area around it, how we did the analysis to create density surface maps that predict the location of birds spatially. Quick summary of our findings, and also some ideas about future monitoring of offshore wind farms. Sorry, this is being a little slow responding. There we go. Rob and Rig offshore wind farm is in the southwest of Scotland. If you see that lower map, the red square indicates approximately where the wind farm is. It belongs to a company called E.ON. It's made up of 60 turbines with a rating of 180 megawatts in total. During the planning of the wind farm, there was a baseline environmental impact assessment with surveys that went on from 2001 to 2002. Following submission of the impact assessment, the wind farm was given consent in March 2003. Construction didn't actually begin until January 2008, but was then completed in February 2010, and the wind farm was operational from March 2010. The key species that we've been interested in at this wind farm have largely been as a result of the license conditions imposed by the consenting authority upon the developer of the wind farm. These species were the two auks that are abundant in that part of Scotland, common guillemot and razorbill, as well as northern gannet. Scotland's particularly important for northern gannet. We have most of the global population breeding within Scottish waters. Although the populations of breeding gannets in the southwest of Scotland are reasonably small, but they are growing. The gannet population in the UK has been growing at about 2% per annum for about 30 years now, and it's in very healthy condition. Red-throated diver was another key species. While it doesn't occur in particularly important numbers in this area, it's a species that has generally been considered to be very sensitive to offshore wind farm development. This has partly been work done elsewhere in the North Sea off Denmark. And in addition, as a result of construction of the wind farm, cormorant became an interesting species. So that's a great cormorant rather than your double-crested cormorants you get in the States. So our survey methods largely involved trawling up and down in boats, looking at birds and writing down what we saw. We used distance-based transect surveys, the so-called European Seabirds at Sea method. This is a standardized method that's used in almost all offshore wind farms for baseline surveys, both in the UK and elsewhere in Europe. The surveys we've undertaken were started in 2004, before the wind farm was constructed, and have continued until they're still continuing now, although I'll only talk about the work that's been done up until 2012. During the pre-construction period, we have been doing one survey per month. They occurred at both high and low tide, and that's the same during the operational phase after the wind farm went live. We've been doing one survey per month. But during the construction phase of the wind farm, we were undertaking two surveys per month, one at high tide and one at low tide. If you look at the lower map, you can see the wind farm is the area marked in magenta, and the yellow lines are essentially the transect lines we've taken in order to survey the wind farm. There are 10 transect lines in total, each of them about 18 kilometers long with roughly about 2 kilometers spacing. As you can see, the yellow lines deviate slightly from the planned lines, and you can also notice on this marine chart that there are no depths given across much of the area. The reason no depth is given is because it's a very mobile sandbank area, and the sandbanks move around an awful lot. In some areas we had problems with the areas being too shallow to survey at certain times, and we had to be careful taking care of during the data analysis phase to take that into account. In order to analyze these data that we collected offshore, we have mostly been looking at density surface models. in order to look at whether the abundance and distribution of these key species that I've already mentioned are being affected by the presence of the wind farm, either during construction or during its operational phase. To do this, each of these survey lines were segmented into 600 by 600 meter blocks, and for each of these segments we extracted covariates. It was necessary to apply data set specific modeling techniques for each species that we analyzed. Prior to analysis, we checked for both collinearity among the covariates within each segment. We also looked at the issues of spatiotemporal autocorrelation and the typical zero inflation issues you get with these kind of count data. The solutions to these three problems were in order to we identified the collinear variables and we removed each of the collinear variables prior to analysis. We included a random effect, which was the transect number, in order to represent position in space and time to deal with a spatio-temporal autocorrelation. And zero inflation was dealt with by using a mixture model. In examining the covariates, we looked at well, you can read them here, the covariates shown. I'll not read them out. In the end, the first four covariates were not included in the model, and it was only the last three, the longitude, latitude, the month, or in some species we use the season, and the time of day were included in the final model. If you look at the map on the right, you can see that the area we covered around the wind farm is uneven, and this was the problem we had in the sort of northern parts of our survey area with shifting sandbanks, meaning we couldn't always survey those areas. So areas that had incomplete transects were just removed from the analysis. So the final model was essentially a mixed additive model that controlled for zero inflation in the data, nonlinear covariates, and spatial autocorrelation. The output are these maps you see, the example given on the right. And in these maps, the darker areas, the darker blue areas indicate higher densities, and the paler yellow areas indicate lower densities. This excuse me, this plot here I'm giving as an example is the type of data that we've often seen in the past from offshore wind farms, where you just look at the different changes in the predicted density of birds on the sea, in this case guillemot, between the pre-construction phase, the blue bars, the construction phase, the red bars in the middle, and the operational phase, the green bars on the right. And if you saw these kind of data, you'd conclude that there was likely to be a strong effect during the construction phase as a result of building the wind farm on the densities of guillemots within the site, and that there's been potentially some sort of recovery that's gone on afterwards, perhaps some sort of habituation to the wind farm. However, since we surveyed a much larger area than just the wind farm and the areas around it, you could start looking at buffer areas, essentially in concentric rings around the wind farm. So we extracted these data from our surface models, and this seems to suggest that during the pre-construction phase, when there's no wind farm present, we're expecting no impact, but the site appears to be more important for, in this case, guillemots than the areas further from the wind farm. But that during the construction phase, this decline with distance from the wind farm seems to disappear, and that appears to be the case also during the operational phase, that we're not getting a difference in densities between the site and the buffers around it. However, when you start looking at the density surface maps, you start to see that the picture is a good deal more complicated than that, and that simply extracting these kind of data from the survey information isn't necessarily giving you a complete picture of what's going on. In this example, we have the predicted densities of guillemot on the water during the pre-construction phase on the left-hand side, during the construction phase in the middle, and during the operational phase on the right-hand side. And you can see that certainly the densities did go down during the construction phase, but that this happened over a very large area and probably further than we would predict guillemots to be affected by the noisy construction events going on within the wind farm. And during the operational phase, it's clear that guillemot numbers have increased again, particularly in the southern half of the survey area, but this isn't in a simple way in relation to the location of the wind farm. What we did next for each of the species was we compared each of these plots. And what you can see here on the left-hand side, the left-hand plot is the difference between the pre-construction densities and the construction phase densities. The darker the colors, darker colors mean an increase in density, and pale colors mean a decrease in density. And the area within, in this case, the red line, indicates where there's been a statistically significant change. We just looked at the standard errors on the prediction of the two within each cell to determine whether the differences were statistically significant. You can see here that during the change from pre-construction to construction, there was a significant decline of birds within the wind farm marked by that magenta line, but that this change occurred also to the west of the wind farm, but not to the east. And when we compare the construction phase to the operational phase, and also the pre-construction to the operational phase, we can see that the pattern is reasonably complex. It's not a simple case of birds clearly declining within the wind farm and then in concentric circles around it. But the change has been complex and not necessarily attributable to the wind farm itself. We can then look at the results for the other species using the same approach. And for razorbill, you can see that numbers certainly declined within the wind farm from pre-construction to construction, but also increased immediately outside the wind farm and decreased in various other areas around the wind farm, particularly to the west and the southeast. But from the construction to the operational phase, we get a large, though not statistically significant, increase due south of the wind farm. And from the pre-construction to the operational phase, we've still got that increase happening in the south of the study area, but a statistically significant decrease just to the north of the wind farm. And again, it's hard to attribute these changes to the wind farm itself. If in this example we're looking at the results from northern gannet, in this case for birds in flight. For northern gannet, most of the data collected was birds in flight. There's a slight difference in that these data are not distance corrected. Birds in flight are counted in what are called snapshots with a 300 by 300 meter box immediately to the front of the and to the side of the transect every 300 meters, so we get continuous recording of birds in flight to a box in front of the vessel. But again, we see a complex pattern of change, both from pre-construction to construction, from construction to operation, and from pre-construction to operation phase, with some increases and some decreases across the area. However, for northern gannet, while it's considered to be an interesting and important species in a UK context, we didn't pick up any pretty important statistically significant changes, with the exception of the pre-construction to operational phase, where if you look at the very south of the study area, there was a statistically significant decrease in an area there. As I mentioned earlier, red-throated diver was a species we predicted would have there might be an important effect from the construction and operation of the wind farm. And despite densities, as you can see in the numbers below each map, densities were very low. We didn't see any clear pattern due to the wind farm, and the model predicts that birds occurred within the wind farm. This was counter to previous work done in Denmark that suggested that red-throated divers could be displaced up to 8 kilometers from a wind farm. I suspect that red-throated divers are likely to be much more susceptible to disturbance generally than, for instance, common loons in North America, which are very tolerant of boat traffic, whereas red-throated divers in Europe and in North America are known to be fairly intolerant of boat traffic. We did pick up a statistically significant decrease in red-throated divers to the far east of our study area, but this is hard to explain and certainly difficult to suggest that this is due to the wind farm. Cormorant was a species that was interesting because of the response to the construction and operation of the wind farm. You can see here it's very clear that the numbers of the densities of cormorants within the wind farm have clearly increased. This is mostly down to birds perching on the transition piece of the wind farm in order to get out of the water and dry out. So cormorants have begun to forage within the wind farm when they previously didn't. If you look at the box in the bottom right, below the right-hand plot, you can see there's almost an order of magnitude change in the densities of cormorants within the wind farm. What is interesting is that this created a health and safety risk to the people working on the wind farm, and as a result they put up measures to prevent cormorants from perching on the transition pieces. And it will be interesting to see whether we can then pick up a decline in cormorants as a result of this management action. So in conclusion, and to summarize this, I think most species certainly should change, temporal change, in both abundance and distribution. But it's hard to attribute this change to the wind farm itself. Some species have showed some declines. Both guillemot and red-throated diver numbers are lower, and some species clearly showed increases. Cormorant went through an order of magnitude change, and also herring gull, which wasn't a key species in the analysis, but we have looked at it, and its numbers have also increased because they also use the transition pieces of the turbines. So. And in addition, some species seem to show little change and little effect due to the wind farm. Gannets seem to have changed. Gannets in flight seem to have changed little, but the densities were generally low. More recent work in the Dutch sector of the North Sea seems to suggest that gannets take avoiding action to avoid entering the wind farm, and we're not seeing a particularly strong pattern from our models for gannets avoiding the wind farm, as they've found in Holland. So, in conclusion, these kind of boat-based surveys can produce complex data sets that require relatively complex analysis, and in particular, both spatial loss of correlation and zero inflation in the data need to be carefully controlled for. Changes were not significant for most species, and I think it's very hard to attribute these changes to the wind farm, but the question remains as to whether our power to detect change was low. We could certainly pick up the order of magnitude increase in cormorant, but smaller magnitude changes may be important at a population level, but we're unable to detect them. But it certainly seems that a simple analysis of a comparison of the wind farm versus a buffer around it, or a wind farm versus a control site away from it, is probably insufficient. That patterns of spatial distribution as a result of construction of wind farms are important. So we need to conduct surveys at a spatial scale that's relevant to both the wind farm and the species of concern that occurred around the wind farm prior to construction. And that future impact assessments, I think, need to be able to incorporate these complex results more fully. Displacement of birds from wind farms is not a simple percentage game. It's likely that we're seeing changes occurring that may well be swamping any signal due to the wind farm itself. And we need to consider these issues when undertaking impact assessments for offshore wind farms. In future, I think this work has certainly shown that boat-based surveys alone can produce useful results, and they can produce large complex data sets that require careful analysis. But statistical power can be low, There is some suggestion this could be indicative of a good place to put a wind farm. If you can't pick up a change, it's maybe because you've put the wind farm in a good location. It's important that we take some of these empirical data and apply them to impact assessments. There has been a tendency for impact assessments in certainly the UK to be based largely on modelling approaches with relatively little empirical evidence being used to determine whether predicted impacts are going to be significant or not. And as I've already underlined, but I would want to underline again, scale is important. It's important that the survey scales are based on the receptors and not just the projects themselves. And that's all from me.
Great. Thank you very much, Dr. Mcgregor. We'll move over to Dr. Debbie Russell, and a little bit about Debbie is she's a research fellow at the University of St. Andrews Sea Mammal Research Unit. Her expertise is in the marine ecosystem and species at the interface between the marine and terrestrial environments, namely seals and seabirds, which are dependent on the marine ecosystem for food, but on the terrestrial environment for breeding. She is particularly interested in interactions on various levels among different taxa between species and humans and between species and their changing environment. Her current research includes the following: using telemetry data to study the impact of marine renewable development and operation on harbor seals, using a mixture of Bayesian and frequentist methods to analyze harbor and gray seal telemetry data to answer both pure and applied research questions, modeling interactions between seals and fisheries in a spatial context, using state space models, and modeling the effects of climate variation on British seabirds. Debbie has a PhD from the University of Leeds. At the end of this presentation, as a reminder, we'll open up the lines and we'll have an interactive Q&A. Over to you, Dr. Russell.
Okay, thanks very much. Okay, so hopefully everyone can hear me okay. I'm going to be talking about the effect of wind farm construction and operation on harbour seals. This is work funded by the UK Department of Energy and Climate Change, and is in collaboration with various people at the Sea Mammal Research Unit here in St Andrews. Okay, just going to work out how to move the slides. Okay, so this work is basically based on telemetry tagging. So that is tags that we've glued onto the back of the necks of seals using just normal super glue, pretty much. These tags stay on until the seals molt. So seals molt every year, so the tags stay on until then, until they molt off. The tags give us information both on the location of the animals and also behavioural data, including dive data. So to give a bit of background to this study, we conducted this study in the Wash, which, if I can get this to work, is this area here, which is in the southeast coast of the UK. The Wash is an important area because it's got a high density of wind farm developments going on. So in 2012, when we conducted this study, there was already some wind farms which were operational, shown in green here, and some which were consented, shown in red, some which were proposed, shown in blue, and search areas which are shown in pink. So the wind farms that we were most interested in for this study were two. The one here called the Lynx Wind Farm, which was under construction during this study, and also the Sheringham Shoal Wind Farm, which was partially operational during this study. The Wash is also an important place because it has a high and increasing population of harbour seals. Over 3,000 individuals actually haul out in this tidal sandbanks here. We were very lucky that we had historic telemetry data from this region. So we put on 24 Argos tags in years prior to any wind farm development in the area at all. So we could look at the kind of normal, if you like, movements of animals within this area prior to any development. So in 2012, we deployed 24 tags in the Wash area again, in this area, to compare the movements of animals in 2012 versus historically prior to development. Okay, so we did this to look at three research questions. Firstly, how do wind farms, both under construction and operating, affect harbour seal distribution? What are the implications of piling? All the foundations for the Links wind farm were put in with impact pile driving. So what are the implications for auditory damage on harbour seals? And how do harbour seals move and behave with regard to operational wind farms? So I'm just going to briefly mention the first one of these, which is how do wind farms under construction and operating affect harbour seal distribution. We're still actually finishing off the analysis from this, so I'm just going to show the raw data. As Ross highlighted in his talk, some of these analyses can be a bit complicated for spatial changes in distribution, and we've got kind of problems with the fact that it's telemetry data, so we only have presence data, so that analysis is ongoing. But the raw data themselves are quite interesting. So this is the historic distribution here from 2003 to 2005. These were Argos tags, which mean they have a lot lower temporal resolution and accuracy than the more recent tags. We've just overlaid on where the wind farms are now. So this was the wind farm under construction and the partially operational wind farm Sheringham Shoal. But obviously these weren't actually there between 2003 and 2005. And then this is the data from the more recent tags deployed in January 2012. These tags stayed on until about July, August for the molt for harbour seals. You can see from these data that there isn't a large-scale, complete displacement of animals from either the wind farm that was under construction or the one that was partially operational. And that's something that regulators were worried about. So although quantitative analysis is obviously required, it's important to kind of bear that in mind. Okay, I'm now going to move on to the second research question, which is what are the implications for piling in terms of auditory damage? This is work led by Gordon Hastie at the Sea Mammal Research Unit, and I'm just going to summarise it now. Okay, so pile driving during the study was characterised by bouts of piling which lasted around 4 to 5 hours. And a total of 5,000 pile driving pulses were produced during the installation of each pile. So we used a series of range-dependent acoustic propagation models to estimate the received levels at each of the seal locations. So this required estimation of the source level and how this varied with the blow energy of the piling stroke. And then we modelled the transmission loss out to the 3D locations of the seals. So overall, we validated these using boat-based recordings during the installation of one of the piles, and we found a relatively good fit of the data with a mean error of about 2.5 dB. Okay, so just to show a little bit more detail, I just want to show the diving profile of one of the harbour seals that was tagged. This is for about an hour of track, so we've got the dive depth on the y-axis here, and the time in seconds on the x-axis. And this seal is diving up to about 25 meters deep. And basically what this is that we've integrated the locations of the seals with the predicted received levels for every pile driving pulse. So these are expressed as single pulse sound exposure levels. And this graph shows the received sound exposure levels for each pulse. So you can see that they're generally higher when the seal was diving deeper than near the surface. So in terms of seal movements, these are the tracks and locations of the seals, which I showed in the previous slide, shown in grey. This is the wind farm here. And you can see that all seals moved relatively close to the wind farm, and that occurred even during pile driving. So these are the sound exposure levels, the single pulse sound exposure levels, for every single pile driving pulse shown for each of the locations. And they range from 121 to 168 dB. Oops. So this is just in more detail. You can see the locations of the turbines here, and the locations of the seals, and the single pulse sound exposure levels overlaid onto the seal locations, where obviously the highest is nearest the generally nearest the turbines, with up to 168 dB. So you can see that there wasn't a large-scale displacement of animals in response to piling. Again, this is something we're going to look at quantitatively. But of course, this can be seen as a positive thing, but we should bear in mind that it potentially elevates the issue of negative consequences through auditory damage. Okay, so implications for auditory damage. We use two approaches to look at both temporary and permanent shifts in hearing ability. So to look at temporary shifts, we use Kaskak's onset, growth and recovery functions for harbour seals to predict the continuous growth and recovery of TTS over the full period of pile driving. Using this, we predicted that all tag seals would experience sound levels sufficient to cause TTS, with almost all predicted to receive temporary threshold shifts of over 6 dB. We also looked at Southall's cumulative sound exposure level threshold as a prediction of PTS onset in pinnipeds, that's permanent threshold shift. The maximum cumulative sound exposure levels for each of the seals varied between 174 and 195 dB. And that means that 12 out of 24 of the seals were predicted to exceed the threshold of 186 dB, consistent with permanent threshold shift. So just to illustrate this in maybe a better way, I'm just going to illustrate these two approaches. So this again is the wind farm here. The red dot here is the current foundation which was being piled, and here we've got the track of a seal over the period of an hour, during which there were 2 piling events. So basically, the bottom panel on the left here shows the timeline of the pile driving associated with the blow energy of the piling strokes, shown in black. And then we've got the predicted growth and recovery of TTS. So the hearing, you can see this recovery between the 2 piling events, and then it starts to increase again. Whereas using Southall's method, there's not such a recovery as the received levels are cumulative through time. So this is based on a 24-hour period that the sounds are cumulative. Okay. So to conclude from this part, we found that there was no large-scale displacement during wind farm construction, during the presence of a wind farm which was partially operational, or during individual piling events. But as I say, we do need to look at whether there were smaller scale redistributions as a result of the construction or piling. We also found that half of the seals were predicted to receive sound levels that exceeded the published thresholds for permanent auditory damage. However, there are very, very important caveats here, which is that sound propagation is challenging in shallow water. There is uncertainty at the moment in metrics and methods for predicting auditory damage. It's a very fast developing field. And there's few studies into the effect of repeated pulse sounds. Okay, so I'm just going to move on to the last research question that we looked at, which was how do harbour seals move and behave in regard to operational wind farms. So this is Sheringham Shoal, which I showed earlier on the map. Now Sheringham Shoal, the pile driving finished about 3 or 4 months before we deployed the tags on the seals. So there was still construction activity going on in Sheringham Shoal when the seals had tags on. And also some of the turbines were operational. So by the end of the study, 30 out of the 88 turbines were operational. Now, previous work has shown that once established, some structures don't seem to exclude marine mammals, but there are marine mammals in the vicinity. So, for example, porpoises in the vicinity of both wind farms and oil platforms. And this could be because of something like an artificial reef, where animals are attracted to these structures in order to forage at them. We were lucky enough, because of the telemetry data and the nature of that data, to actually show with one individual I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to show this. Let's see. Sorry, bear with me. I'm not sure whether I'm going to be able to show this video. I don't know whether Elise can advise. Sorry. Maybe not. Okay, so anyway, I'll describe it anyway. So this is the aerial kind of picture image of Sheringham Shoal, where there's about 500 metres between each of the turbines here. And we found that 8 out of the 24 animals that were tagged went into Sheringham Shoal, but one of them showed a very interesting pattern, which I had hoped to show you on this video, but I don't think it's going to be possible to do so. So I'm just going to...
Debbie, you could share your desktop with that video playing in another window if you'd like.
Sorry, say again?
You can share your desktop if you want to show that in a different video. I don't know if it'll work on the presentation slide.
Okay, don't worry. I'm not totally sure how to do that. So I'll just skip to the picture, and then maybe after the talks, maybe we can get it playing. Okay, so I'll just skip to the slide, which basically shows the resulting pattern. So this is again Sheringham Shoal, but the red dots are the structures in the wind farm. And as I say, there's about 500 metres between these structures, and we found that one individual systematically used the structures. So it appeared to forage these structures. It went from one structure to the next structure as if it was kind of checking them out for foraging opportunities. So we're really interested by this, but obviously it was just one animal that showed this out of the 8. And so we wanted to understand, were the animals definitely foraging at these structures? And we thought this was probably likely to be the case, but we wanted to quantify this. So we looked at using a state space model, which we'd previously used for seals to show foraging and travelling activity. Now what we do is we look at the foraging, to look at kind of foraging versus travelling. The foraging is associated with more tortuous movements which are slower, and travelling is associated with kind of more directed movements. And so using this model, we found that the majority of the foraging that this animal showed was actually within the wind farm itself. And using generalized estimating equations, we also found that the probability of foraging was highest as you got nearer to the structure. Now, although we only found this in one individual in Sheringham Shoal, this has been observed in other places. So our colleagues at Imerez in the Netherlands, Sophie Brasseur and Gerrit Aerts, recorded data from a wind farm in Germany, Alpha Ventus. Now here we've got the red dots, which are a high probability of foraging using the state space model, and blue, which is a high probability of travelling. And you can see that for the 12 wind turbines here, the animals have this one animal has concentrated its foraging activity on the structures. What's interesting is that it's concentrated a lot of its activity on the structure just to the west of the wind farm, which is in fact a met mast which was about 10 years older, it'd been there 10 years longer than the wind farm structures themselves, the turbines themselves. So there's a possibility it had more of an established artificial reef, which may have attracted more attention from the animal. And we actually observed 2 animals showing this behaviour in Alpha Ventus. So to conclude from this part of the study, we found that some individuals do forage at wind farm foundations. However, the importance and the consequences of this behaviour for both prey and for the seals is not really known. So it's likely that animals are going to these structures due to a reef effect. So there's a concentration of invertebrates and fish at these structures. However, for the most part, it's not known whether the reef effect results in an attraction of fish that are already in the surrounding environment, thus concentrating them in a small area, making them more vulnerable to predation by things like seals, or whether it's actually increasing the biomass, increasing the production of fish, which might make them actually sustainable foraging opportunities for seals. There's also potential negative side effects with seals spending a lot of time in wind farms, because there's much more likely to be interactions with maintenance vessels and things like that in somewhere where there's a lot of anthropogenic activity. And also, although a recent study by Tugard showed that wind farms, while operational, they're quite loud and harbour seals would be able to hear them. However, he showed that it was unlikely that they would get any auditory damage from this sort of noise. However, this was before our study in which we showed that actually some of the individuals spend days at a time within these wind farms and concentrate that time at the structures themselves where the noise is likely to be highest. Finally, what we're also unsure about is the prevalence of the behaviour. These wind farms we looked at are very new, so the Sheringham Shoal wind farm had only been there a few months when this animal started apparently using the structures to forage. And so it's unclear whether the number of animals showing that kind of activity would increase as the reefs get more established. Now, we did try and look at this to some extent in terms of pipelines, which often have been there for a very long time. And we found that both harbour seals and grey seals do seem to forage at pipelines. But unfortunately for the North Sea, there isn't a centralised database of what sections of pipeline are exposed or buried. So it's very difficult to understand what proportion of animals which encounter these structures actually use them for foraging. Okay, just remains for me to thank everyone, especially the UK Department of Energy and Climate Change, Centrica for providing the piling data, and various other people and organisations. Thank you very much.
Terrific. Thank you so much to both speakers for two really interesting presentations and beautiful slides. We're going to contact the operator now to unmute the lines. Please start thinking about your questions, and we'll be back with you in 1 minute. Great, thank you. We have, the lines are now open, so we'll open it up to ask questions directly to our speakers. We have one question that came in over the webinar, and that is for Ross, and it's, are there any data about collision mortality for birds?
This wind farm hasn't done any, it hasn't collected any empirical evidence on collision mortality. It's only very recently that any methods for collecting empirical data have come forward. There's a large research program referred to as ORGIP, the Offshore Renewable Joint Industries Program, that are trying to measure empirical data on collisions at a wind farm in southeast England. But it's the only wind farm in the UK trying to do that. Everything else is just based on models and assumptions at the moment.
Can you please repeat that organization that's doing that?
It's called the Offshore Renewables Joint Industry Program. It's a collaboration between the Department of Energy and Climate Change in the UK and the developers themselves of various wind farms around the UK.
Thank you.
There are other questions from the group, and if you're asking questions, maybe introduce yourself so the speakers know who they're hearing from. That'd be great.
Sure. This is Eric Ritter from LeadCo in Cleveland, Ohio.
Oh, thank you.
If there aren't any other questions, I kind of wanted to ask for you to expand a little bit more on methods for doing collision mortality for birds in offshore wind farms.
Is that method for collecting empirical evidence for collisions or the modelling of predictions?
Both.
The modelling of predictions in most cases is using a standardized model that was produced by a group called the Strategic Ornithological Support Services that was funded by the Crown Estate. The Crown Estate own the seabed around the UK, and they effectively lease these sites to developers. They produced a model specifically for use in an offshore environment that uses the type of aerial density data we collect. It's essentially an extension of the original model produced by Vance Tucker at Duke University in North Carolina back in the late 90s. It's a fairly simple mechanical model that's just looking at the relative size and speed of the rotors of the turbines versus the relative size and speed of the birds. And based on the aerial densities, the flight height distribution, and the avoiding behavior, we make a fairly rough prediction of what the collision mortality might be. This is also used onshore, and in most onshore cases, you can go out and collect carcasses of birds to give you an idea of what the actual collision rate is. At sea, it's obviously not possible to do that. Any carcasses either sink or get swept away very, very quickly. What this ORGIT project is doing is using a combination of radar and observers to try and measure avoiding behavior rather than collisions per se. They will try to measure collisions, but they're likely to be so rare that it would be very difficult to empirically collect that data offshore. But avoiding behavior is something that you can collect offshore, and they've divided the avoiding behavior into 3 phases. There's a macro phase, which is looking at birds avoiding the wind farm as a whole. What's referred to as a meso phase, which is a response of birds, often in height, to fly lower as a result of being within the wind farm, and also micro avoidance, which is the kind of last minute duck to avoid the blade. And using observers and radar, they're hoping to measure those parameters.
So if cormorants are being attracted to the transition piece, isn't it likely that they will also come into contact with the rotating blade?
By and large, cormorants in flight are very low and very close to the water. Their flight height distribution rarely takes them as high as that. Birds flying up to the transition piece are obviously coming closer to the rotor swept area, but they're still below it. So it certainly increases the likelihood of there being a collision, and attraction of that type is certainly something that is of concern, and one of the things that, more for gulls, because they inherently fly higher anyway. Their foraging at sea seems to be based on flying up high and having a look around and see if they can see either other groups of gulls foraging or fishing boats, and then flying down to them, so that their height distribution takes them more into a collision risk zone than a bird like a cormorant. But they also use the transition pieces. So something that's bringing a high-flying bird to transition pieces could potentially create a problem. The way that would be dealt with within the impact assessment is through this avoidance rate. The collision risk modeling that predicts the collision mortality applies an avoidance rate that is trying to take into account all of the factors that create the difference between the prediction and the actual collision mortality.
Thank you.
No problem.
Looks like another question came in over the webinar, and that's from Mark Caldwell for Dr. Mcgregor. The question is, do you think the attraction of the turbine bases to herring gulls and cormorants are similar to that for the harbor seals, who appear to use them as foraging sites, as Dr. Russell mentioned?
There are some similarities. In addition to this work, we've been doing monitoring the benthic environment at this site, and we've recently been putting drop-down video around the turbines, and there's certainly a lot of juvenile fish starting to be attracted to these turbines now. And it seems likely that the cormorants are being attracted by this and foraging there. But the reason they weren't there before was they couldn't leave the water. They're a very coastal bird, because when they forage, they get wet and they need to get out of the water to dry their feathers. So having a perching area attracts them as much as the additional foraging that's available. I think with herring gulls, because they're only foraging in the very top of the water, maybe the top half a meter of the water, probably less than that, there's less of a reef effect on herring gulls, but they get attracted to, again, just perch on these sites to roost.
This is Sarah Delisle with the U.S. Navy in Southern California. I was wondering if there are any follow-on studies not yet mentioned as a result of some of the information recently collected in your study.
Is that a question for myself in regards to Robin Rig?
I guess for both of you.
For Robin Rig, the monitoring work will continue until next year, and then it will stop at that point for 5 years, and then there will be another year of survey work after that at that site, looking at displacement of birds as a result of the wind farm.
Just to follow on from the harvester work, I think one of the main things is that because we found that only 1 out of 8 of the animals that went into Sheringham Shoal showed this kind of interesting behaviour. We want to know whether this is possibly because the structures were so new. And so we're hoping to put on some more tags in the next few months to look at whether more animals are now using the structures.
Is there any other questions? We'll wait a minute or two, let people...
Could I ask a question to Ross, if possible?
Of course.
Yeah, so it's Debbie here. I was just wondering in kind of a little bit, if you could give us a little bit more detail about the kind of models that you use to look at the change in spatial distribution. We've been using a few models, like, for example, GAMS and mixed sex GAMS and things like that to try and do that with the data that we've got on the seals. But we've come across some problems, including edge effects and also the flexibility of the surface depending on how many knots you put in the smoother. And I was just wondering whether you could give a little bit more detail on kind of what model you were using.
Sure. I mean, this was based on a GAM, and it does, it does have these problems that you were mentioning, and this analysis has actually moved on for our most recent report on this site, which I would have preferred to have talked about, but unfortunately I'm waiting on EON to release the report, where we are using a slightly different model produced by CREAM, the Centre for Research into Environmental and Ecological Modelling, I believe.
Yeah.
University of Andrews.
Yeah, okay. So no, I was wondering about that. That's a similar thing to some degree. I work with CREAM as well, so yeah. Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? Let's just wait another a minute to give people a chance to ask questions before we don't want to cut anybody off.
Perhaps if there aren't questions, just to follow up with the question that Debbie asked for anyone there who's interested in this type of analysis, there is now an R package available from CREAM to do this analysis probably slightly better than we've done it here.
Sorry, and just to add to that, the contact for that would be Lindsay Scott Hayward at CREAM. I wasn't able to show the video, but I emailed Sam the video, a link to the video, which is on YouTube, so I don't know if it's possible to put that up on the webinar in case people want to see it.
Yeah, I can actually show that right now. I'll pull it up and show it for people to see.
Great. Thank you very much.
Debbie, would you like to walk us through this?
Yeah, sure. So basically, it kind of looks it looks a bit funny the way it's come across on the screen, but basically this is just the track of the individual that showed the interesting behaviour. So it went into the wind farm on each of its 13 trips to sea, and it spent days on end in the wind farm, and it went from kind of structure to structure, and it stopped only at particular structures. So it was really kind of looking what food was available, and then only stopping to forage if there was something available. So,
video too. What is it? On your end. Thank you.
Hi, can I ask a question for Debbie?
sure.
Yeah, this is Rachel speaking from SMO Marine.
Hello.
You said there on the video that the seal only targeted certain ones of the structures. Did you know if they were the older structures that had more of a chance to grow reefs for the seals to target, or if there was anything there?
Yeah, so no, it's a really good point. So it was kind of bizarre when we first saw this behaviour, because it basically, the seal ignores the bottom two rows of structures completely. And unfortunately, we didn't quite get the information in time to publish it, but we found out afterwards that it was indeed the older structures that the seals had concentrated on. So the last two rows of the structures that the seal ignores are actually the newer ones.
Okay, great. Thank you.
No problem.
More questions? Well, if there is, we can talk about it again after maybe spending a few minutes on potential future webinar topics. Some topics that we brainstormed internally here are shown on the screen, and wanted to take a minute to see if anyone had some input on potential future topics of interest for this audience. We have impacts of turbines on birds by looking at population modeling and effects modeling, where we could focus on strike modeling in particular, or we could use focus in particular on displacement models. And there's, of course, many other ideas, but we wanted to just potentially see the conversation on potential future topics. If anyone has any thoughts or suggestions. Well, if you do it a later day, we'd love to hear from you. We'll put up the contact information again, and please feel free to contact us if you have ideas, suggestions for this webinar series. We're hoping to make it as beneficial and useful as possible. And these presentations today were terrific. Thank you so much to our two speakers, Dr. Mcgregor and Dr. Russell. We really appreciate the time you took to share your research with us today. And as a reminder, we're going to post the presentations and the transcript from the conference call in the near future. Okay, if there's nothing else, we'll convene the call right now. Thank you very much.